People keep asking me if I lost it, if I threw something, if I yelled. They want to know if I fell apart. I didn't. And I think that scared my son more than anything else I could have done. I'd been up in Sudbury for 11 days. A property assessment situation. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of thing that takes longer than it should when you're dealing with municipal offices and contractors who don't return calls on time. My wife, Beverly, had stayed home. She'd been dealing with some fatigue, nothing alarming, just the kind of tired that settles into you when you get to your 60s, and your body starts having opinions about everything. Her blood pressure had been running a little high for a few months. Her doctor had adjusted her medication in September. We thought we had it under control. I called her every night, every single night. She sounded fine, maybe a little quieter than usual, but I chalked that up to the empty house. We've been married 34 years. I know the difference between Beverly being tired and Beverly being in trouble. Or I thought I did. The drive back from Sudbury to our home in Barrie takes about 2 hours on a good day. I left earlier than I planned because something felt off. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't fully explain it now. I just had a feeling, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't move. So I didn't call ahead. I just drove. I pulled into the driveway just after 3 in the afternoon. I noticed a second car parked out front, a dark green SUV I didn't recognize. I assumed it was one of Beverly's friends. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, walked up to the front door, and let myself in. What I saw when I stepped into the living room is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Beverly was on the floor beside the couch. She was sitting up, barely, with one hand pressed against the wall like she was trying to hold herself steady. There was blood on her face. From her nose, it looked like, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She had been there a while. I could tell by the way she was sitting, the way a person sits when they've been through something and run out of the energy to even call for help. I dropped my bag. I was at her side in 3 steps. Beverly. Beverly, look at me. She looked up and the relief on her face. I don't have a word for it. It wasn't happiness. It was something more like the look a person gets when they finally realize they're not going to drown. I've been trying to get up, she said. Her voice was barely there. My head started. I couldn't. I told her not to talk. I called 911. And then, from the back of the house, from the direction of the kitchen, I heard laughter. I want you to sit with that for a second. My wife, on the floor of our living room, bleeding, couldn't get up, had clearly been there for a significant amount of time. And from 30 feet away, I could hear 2 people laughing like they were watching something funny on television. The 911 operator was calm and professional, the way they always are. I gave her our address. I gave her Beverly's symptoms. I stayed on the line the way they ask you to. The whole time in the back of the house, the laughter continued. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. 8 minutes that felt like a very long time. While I waited, I walked to the kitchen doorway. My son, Mitchell, was sitting at the kitchen table with his father-in-law, a man I'll call Vince, and Vince's wife. They had coffee in front of them, and a plate of food that had come from my refrigerator. Mitchell looked up at me with an expression I would describe as startled, but not alarmed, not guilty, just startled, like I'd interrupted a conversation. He said, "Dad, hey, you're back early." That was what he said. I looked at him for a moment. I didn't say anything. Then I went back to Beverly. I found out later that Beverly had collapsed, or near collapsed, about 2 hours before I arrived. Mitchell had been in the kitchen with Vince and Vince's wife when it happened. He'd come to check on her, he said, and she'd told him she was okay. She had not been okay. She'd been trying to manage it on her own because she didn't want to be a burden. That's Beverly. 34 years, and that woman would rather crawl than ask someone to carry her. Mitchell went back to his conversation. He didn't call me. He didn't call 911. He didn't sit with her, or bring her water, or do anything beyond a single check-in that he accepted far too easily. He went back to his conversation. When the paramedics came through the front door, they had to pass the living room to get to Beverly. Vince and his wife came out of the kitchen at the sound of the door and stood in the hallway watching. I was kneeling next to Beverly. One of the paramedics, a young woman who was very good at her job, started asking Beverly questions and checking her vitals. Her blood pressure was extremely elevated. They got her stabilized. They assessed her carefully and determined she didn't need emergency transport, but they were very clear that she needed rest, monitoring, and that someone needed to be with her. I thanked them. I walked them to the door. Then I turned around. Mitchell was standing in the hallway. Vince and his wife were still there. Nobody had said a word. Your mother is going to be all right, I said. But I need you all to step outside with me for a moment. We went to the front porch. It was a cool afternoon, October, the leaves almost gone from the maple out front. I asked Mitchell calmly why he had not called for help. He said he didn't think it was that serious. I asked him how long his mother had been on the floor. He said he wasn't sure. An hour, maybe. Maybe a little longer. I nodded. I didn't raise my voice. I turned to Vince and asked him what brought them to our home that day. What came out over the next few minutes was something I hadn't expected. And looking back, I probably should have seen it coming. Vince and his wife had driven up from Mississauga, which is about an hour and a half from Barrie. They'd called Mitchell a few weeks earlier, apparently, about a piece of property. Not their property, mine. I own a lot in Collingwood, a piece of land I inherited from my father, who bought it in the 70s. It's not a grand estate. It's a few acres outside of town, mostly trees, with a small cabin on it that I've been meaning to properly renovate for years. Nothing dramatic, but it borders a parcel that a developer has been looking at, and apparently that developer had reached out to Vince, who works in real estate, about acquiring adjacent land. The specific request that day was for Mitchell to sign a document, because Vince had somehow convinced him, or Mitchell had chosen to believe, that since I was out of town and Mitchell was handling things, he had some kind of authority to start conversations about the property. He didn't. He has no legal standing to sign anything related to anything I own. But Vince had prepared paperwork, and they'd driven 2 hours to get a signature on it. On the day my wife collapsed on the living room floor, they'd come to my home to get my son to sign papers on property he doesn't own. I looked at Vince for a long moment. I think you should leave now, I said. He started to explain. He said it was just preliminary, just an expression of interest, just Vince, I said. I'm not going to ask again. He and his wife left. I watched them back out of the driveway in that dark green SUV. Neither of them said anything to Mitchell before they left. They just went. I went inside. Mitchell followed me. We sat at the kitchen table, that same table where he'd been laughing an hour earlier, and I told him I needed a few minutes before I could speak. He nodded. I could see for the first time that he understood something had shifted. His expression had changed. Some of the casualness was gone. I want to be honest with you about what I was feeling in that moment. I was angry, yes, but more than that, I was tired and sad. The anger was on the surface, but underneath it was something heavier. The particular grief of a parent who realizes their child has become a person they don't fully recognize. Mitchell is 31 years old. He graduated from Lakehead, works in project management, married a woman named Andrea 2 years ago. For most of his adult life, Beverly and I have supported him more than we should have. Not because he asked badly, or because we were manipulated, just because it was always easier to say yes than to say no, and deal with what came after. We co-signed his first apartment lease in Thunder Bay. We gave him a supplementary credit card that I've been paying down for 4 years. When he and Andrea moved back to Ontario, I used my professional connections to help him get his current position. I opened doors. That was my choice. I want to own that. But there's a difference between a parent who helps and a parent who enables. I'd spent years confusing the two. I asked Mitchell, once I was ready to talk, if he understood what had happened that day. Not what had happened with Vince and the property, what had happened with his mother. He said yes. I asked him to tell me. He said she'd had an episode. He said it looked like it was passing. I told him that his mother's blood pressure had been high enough that the paramedics were concerned. I told him that she'd been on the floor for over an hour. I told him that I'd stood in the doorway and heard him laughing while she was sitting against the wall, alone, not able to get up. He said he'd checked on her. I said, Mitchell, you checked on her once, she said she was okay, and you went back to the kitchen. That was not enough. You know her history. You know about her blood pressure. You had a phone in your pocket and you didn't use it. He didn't have anything to say to that. I said, and then there's the other thing. I told him what Vince had shared and I told him what I understood from it. I asked him directly whether he had agreed, in any form, to assist with discussions about my Collingwood property. He said they'd just talked. He said he hadn't signed anything. I said, you let a man drive 2 hours to our home, to my home, while I was away, with paperwork for a property that isn't yours. And you didn't call me to tell me he was coming. You didn't ask me if it was all right. You hosted him in my kitchen while your mother was on the floor. Mitchell looked down at the table. I told him I wasn't going to yell. I told him this wasn't that kind of conversation. I said what I needed to say in a measured way because Beverly was in the other room and she didn't need to hear doors slamming or voices raised. Then I told him what was going to happen. I called the bank from the kitchen table while he sat across from me. I removed him from the supplementary card. The representative was professional and efficient. It took about 4 minutes. I called the management company that co-signed his lease in Burlington and notified them that I was withdrawing my name. That conversation took a bit longer and involved leaving a message, but I followed up in writing within the hour. I sent a text to 2 people, colleagues of mine in the industry, who I'd personally introduced Mitchell to, and who had been central to him landing his current job. I didn't say anything dramatic. I simply let them know that my professional endorsement of Mitchell should be considered withdrawn, and that I'd explain if they wanted to speak further. One of them called me back within 20 minutes. The other responded by text. Both of them were understanding. I want to be clear, I'm not a spiteful person. I didn't do any of this to punish Mitchell in a theatrical way. I did it because what happened that day told me something about who my son had become, and I understood that continuing to subsidize that version of him was not doing either of us any favors. The support I'd been providing had not been building him up. It had been holding him in place. There's a difference. When I was done, I set my phone face down on the table. I told Mitchell that I loved him. I meant it. I mean it now. I told him that the doors I had opened for him were now closed. Not forever, necessarily, but for now. And that what he chose to do with that was entirely up to him. He started to speak. He started to explain about Vince, about how it had seemed reasonable, about how he hadn't thought his mother was in that much trouble. I said, Mitchell, I need you to go home tonight. He went. I heard the front door close, and I sat at that kitchen table for a few minutes by myself. I looked at the plate of food that was still sitting there, the coffee cups, the afternoon light coming through the window over the sink. I thought about the drive up from Sudbury, about that feeling in my chest that had made me leave early. I thought about my father, and the land in Collingwood, and what he would have said about all of this. Then I got up and went to the bedroom. Beverly was awake. Her color was better. The paramedics had told her to rest and to take her medication and to keep the next morning clear for a follow-up with her doctor. She had her glasses on, and she was not, as I'd half expected, trying to get up and do something. She was just resting, which was a small miracle in itself. I sat on the edge of the bed. She said, "How bad was it?" I said, "I've handled it." She looked at me in that way she's been doing it for 34 years, that particular look that means she knows there's more, but she's choosing to let it rest for now. She reached over and put her hand on mine. I held on to it. Outside, I could hear the wind coming off the water. October in Barrie. The kind of afternoon that feels like the year is finishing something it started a long time ago. I sat there with Beverly's hand in mine, and I let myself exhale for the first time since I'd walked through that front door. We didn't talk about Mitchell that night. There was time for that later. There will be more conversations, more difficult ones probably, and I don't know exactly how this resolves. I know that I love my son. I know that what I did that afternoon came from love, not anger, even if it didn't feel that way to him in the moment. What I know is this. A man can only hold a door open for so long before he has to let go of it. And sometimes letting go is the most honest thing a father can do. Beverly is home. She is resting, and her doctor is monitoring her closely, and she is home. That is the only thing that matters tonight.